senior leaders from the BJP and RSS have called for the term secular to be removed from the preamble. Now, secularism, by various definitions, has had a long and difficult history in the Indian subcontinent. Muslim rulers from the Delhi Sultanate onwards, roughly the 12th to 13th century CE, are widely considered to have been intolerant of other religions. Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain rulers from earlier centuries are, in contrast, portrayed as encouraging debates but preventing religious violence. But neither of these views are based on clear-eyed readings of the evidence. The fact is that across time, Indian rulers have had a hard-headed approach to religion. When tolerance was profitable, it was encouraged. In times of religious conflict, though, kings had no obligation to be secular or to protect minorities. To understand this, let's look specifically at the confrontation between Jainism, once the Deccan's premier religion, with a 12th century Shaivite movement over 200 years before the Delhi Sultanate arrived in the region. Now, while Jainism today is most popular in Western India, in the early medieval period, roughly 600 to 1100 CE, it was one of the dominant religions of present-day Karnataka. In its heyday, Deccan Jainism was lavished with royal patronage. Kings in North and South Karnataka received initiation from Jain gurus and claimed the favor of Jain goddesses. Jain monasteries were patronized by village headmen, landlords, and merchants, and right up to the early 12th century, it was perfectly possible for many religions to coexist in Karnataka. Not only did members of the same family receive initiation from different sects, but royals often took care to patronize all religions. Boundaries between these religions were blurry. There were Jain Mahabharatas, and Shaivite rulers praised Jain temples and inscriptions, and as historian Leslie C. Orr shows in Identity and Divinity, Boundary Crossing Goddesses in Medieval South India, lay people often worshipped both Hindu and Jain deities without belonging solely to either sect. But by the late 12th century, some major social, political, and economic transformations were afoot. In The Origins of the Vira Shiva movement, historian R.N. Nandi argues that elite temple-based religion grew increasingly disconnected from working-class people. This is supported by archaeologists Peter Johansson and Andrew M. Bao in their book Reconceptualizing the Archaeology of Southern India. Analyzing the changing patterns of land use and donation in the Raichur region, they suggest that extensive gifts of land to religious institutions, and I quote, generated social discontent among a range of inhabitants of the Deccan, end quote. Now, as often happens in times of inequality and social stress, this quickly led to a wave of discontent expressed through religion. Chasing patronage, religious leaders drew clear boundaries around their communities and attacked the other. Sometimes these attacks were rhetorical, but often they were not. Around this time, a set of revolutionary voices singing in common Kannada erupts into the historical record. The voices of Shiva's heroes, or the Vira Shivas. Shiva's heroes challenged everything. They challenged the caste system, the centrality of Vedic scripture and expensive temple rituals, and in some cases, the concept of marriage itself. And Vira Shivas for sure did not shy away from criticizing Brahminical institutions, but wealthy Jain establishments were more frequently a target. Now, I want to be clear that the resulting confrontation, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, the resulting confrontation says very little about how either Hinduism or Jainism have evolved today. But the events of the 12th century can still show us something about the dynamics of a majority versus a minority when a state chooses a side or doesn't get involved. In the edited volume Jaina Culture in Medieval Karnataka, Dominance, Dependency and Endurance, historians Julia A.B. Hegewald, P.S.F. Pinto and Tiziana Lorenzetti examine what happened to medieval Jains. Merchants such as the Settis and Banajigas or Banias, formerly Jains, received Vira Shiva initiation in the Deccan region. Now, this was a canny move. They could sense the winds changing. Minor chiefs and royal houses quickly followed. Soon, Virashaiva leaders were challenging Jain monks to debate. The historical record shows that after defeating them with arguments or miracles, they sometimes attacked Jain communities and either destroyed or converted their temples. At least that's the picture painted by Virashaiva records. An inscription at Abalur dating to the 1180s relates the story of Ekanta the Ramaya, a Virashaiva leader who supposedly beheaded himself during a debate with Jains. After 7 days, Shiva restored his head and he led an attack on the local Jain temple. Now, other Deccan political leaders found it profitable to simply attack Jain communities outright. P.B. Desai, a historian of Jainism, shows through inscriptions that Deccan lords Goggarasa and Viruparasa, which literally mean King Gogga and King Virupa, claim titles such as the hunter of the wild beasts, which are the Jainas, a fire to the Jaina scriptures, and an axe to the followers of Jaina, claiming to have encountered the advocates of alien doctrines at a host of towns and to have, and I quote from their inscription, made the world quake, pounded and powdered the Jain temples, and raised the thrones of Shivalingas, displaying aloft on the open altar the paramountcy of the god Shiva. Now, there's also substantial archaeological evidence of Vira Shiva attacks on Jain temples. In the Siddheshwara temple at Haveri, for example, it's still possible to see that the Jain sculptures in the spine of the superstructure have been erased while a lingam was set up in the interior. Jain historian Shantinath Dibbad, in the edited volume The Jaina Heritage, Distinction, Decline and Resilience, estimates, based on Vira Shiva textual claims, that between 1800 to 2000 Jain temples were destroyed or converted in the 12th and 13th centuries. Now, obviously, such medieval claims were intended to be over the top, but there's still a palpable sense of fear in Deccan Jain texts, such as the Samaya Parikshe of Brahma Shiva. Brahma Shiva was a resident of present-day Patancheru near Hyderabad, and in many ways his views eerily echo those of minority leaders today. In her paper Polemic, Diatribe and Farce, historian Shubha Shantamurthy writes that Brahma Shiva complained about forcible conversion and persecution. He demanded that Jains must strictly protect their faith, support only each other, and prevent Jain women from marrying outside their community. Brahma Shiva had good reason to be worried. On the Vira Shiva side, the Basava Purana relates the story of Dedara Dasaya, the guru of Patancheru's local queen, Suggala Devi. Dasaya, according to the Purana, defeated the Jains in debate with a miraculous crystal lingam. He then, and I quote from the Purana, established the crystal linga in the town and then destroyed the 700 Jain vasadis or temples. Now, what did the Deccan states and the rulers do about the persecution of Jains? Not much, unfortunately. As historians note in the Jaina Heritage, the middle aristocracy, both merchants and landlords, supported Virashaivas, whether for religious or economic reasons, it's difficult to say. And lower castes, who made up the economic backbone of the state, received Virashaiva initiation en masse. All these groups made up the infrastructure of the state on the ground, and there were no independent judicial institutions to enforce order. Amid all these upheavals, Delhi Sultanate forces made rapid advances into the Deccan, completely overturning the political and religious situation. It was only in the late 14th century, as the Vijayanagara Empire consolidated power, that courtly elites tried to systematically enforce tolerance of all communities, possibly to prevent local conflicts and maintain order. The Vijayanagara state authority was much more extensive than those of earlier kingdoms. It was exercised through a network of Vedic, Advaita and Vaishnavite mathas across a huge swathe of South India. In 1368, the Vijayanagara king Bukka travelled all the way to Shravanabelagola in South Karnataka since, and I'm quoting from the inscription, the blessed Jainas complained about an injustice done by Sri Vaishnava Bhaktas. The king requested Sri Vaishnava authorities from as far away as Tirumala and Srirangam to take these Jains under their protection, declaring that they were entitled to various honours and requesting that the Sri Vaishnavas considered the Jains' fortunes or misfortunes their own. The Sri Vaishnavas were to set up a declaration to this effect in all Jain temples across the kingdom. But whether this actually worked is debatable. The inscription is an exception in the echoing silence of Deccan Jain inscriptions from the 14th century onwards, where once there had been hundreds of donations. Sri Vaishnava mega temple complexes were thriving, and mathas had plenty to keep them busy. I've been unable to find Sri Vaishnava sponsored declarations of friendship with Jainas, though more may come to light in future. The fact is that by the 14th century, Jain communities had lost so much power that few new establishments were set up except in coastal Karnataka. It was impossible to reclaim old temples in North Karnataka because many had been absorbed into new Virashaiva monasteries. But what is interesting is that Vijayanagara did have a concept of state-enforced religious tolerance, even if the institutional backing was the royal court and its allied mathas. But was this sufficient to protect the rights and dignities of Jains, who were now a minority? When everyone did their jobs as intended, possibly, but in practice, so much depended on local politics, on the ruler's limitations, on the priorities of matha heads. In Vijayanagara ruled Andhra as late as the 16th century, inscriptions show that lords claimed titles such as Shvetambara Talagunduganda, a menace to the heads of the Shvetambara Jains. So, what does this say for secularism in India in the 21st century? Of course, the fate of Deccan Jains, I hope, is not that of all minorities, nor do a few Deccan kingdoms establish a pattern of state behavior that applies everywhere in the subcontinent. But that's really my point. The Republic of India's understanding of religious policy should not be based only on this or that North Indian Sultan, but on a sober understanding of the dynamics of majority and minority communities throughout time. Any religion's ideas of righteous violence can very quickly transform depending on socio-political opportunities, and societies don't simply self-correct. History shows us that they choose the path of least resistance. Only laws, institutions, and state capacity will enable India's religious diversity to stand the test of time. I'm sure this is a controversial opinion, so if you have questions or comments, we'd love to hear them. Follow us everywhere on social media. You can find me on Instagram at Anirudh and on Twitter at Kanisetti. We'll see you next week.